What if your life was sacred, even when you wanted escape?
Life as a gift, not a possession. In Christianity, life is never described as an object to be owned, controlled, or discarded, but as a gift that originates entirely outside of human will. The biblical narrative begins with God breathing life into humanity, establishing from the very beginning that existence itself is an act of grace rather than achievement. A gift, by its nature, implies a giver, and Christianity insists that God remains the true owner of life, while humans are entrusted as caretakers. This understanding reshapes the meaning of human freedom, because freedom is not the right to destroy what one has been given, but the responsibility to protect it, even when it becomes heavy, painful, or confusing. Life retains its sacredness not because it feels meaningful to the person living it, but because it reflects the intention of the one who gave it. When suffering enters human experience, Christianity does not claim that life loses value. Instead, it claims that value exists independently of emotion, success, or happiness. The belief that life is a divine gift places it beyond human authority to end, even when despair makes that ending appear merciful. The commandment that defines value. The commandment "you shall not kill" is often misunderstood as a purely legal restriction, but within Christianity it functions as a declaration of human worth. It affirms that no life is disposable, not even one overwhelmed by pain, confusion, or despair. Suicide is traditionally considered a sin within Christian theology because it directly contradicts this commandment, not by hatred of the self, but by treating life as something that can be revoked by human decision. This interpretation is rooted not in punishment, but in reverence. To forbid killing is to insist that life is never meaningless, even when it feels unbearable. Christianity teaches that suffering does not nullify dignity, and weakness does not erase sacredness. The commandment stands as a boundary that protects life precisely when emotions argue against its value. Hope, despair, and the spiritual struggle. In Christian theology, despair is not merely sadness, but a collapse of hope itself. Hope is not defined as optimism or emotional comfort, but as trust that God's presence continues even when suffering feels endless. Suicide has traditionally been viewed as a rejection of this hope, a moment when pain convinces the soul that no future exists beyond the present agony. Despair narrows vision, isolates the sufferer, and silences the belief that God is still at work. Christianity teaches that despair is dangerous not because it makes someone weak, but because it lies about reality. It whispers that pain is permanent, that meaning is gone, and that existence itself is a mistake. From this perspective, suicide represents not a desire for death, but a desperate attempt to escape unbearable suffering. When suffering distorts freedom. Modern Christian theology introduces a crucial distinction between the moral act and the psychological condition of the person performing it. Depression, trauma, and mental illness are now recognized as forces that can profoundly impair perception, judgment, and freedom. A person in extreme despair may not experience choice in the way moral theory assumes, because pain can dominate consciousness so completely that alternatives feel non-existent. Christianity increasingly acknowledges that such suffering reduces personal responsibility, not by excusing the act, but by recognizing the wounded state of the human mind. God's judgment, in this view, does not ignore suffering, but accounts for it fully. Where earlier theology emphasized the act itself, contemporary thought emphasizes the person behind the act, whose freedom may have been crushed long before the final decision. The wounds left in others. Christian teaching also recognizes that suicide does not end suffering, it transfers it. Families and friends are left with grief complicated by guilt, unanswered questions, and a silence that feels impossible to penetrate. This reality is not emphasized to assign blame, but to acknowledge how deeply human lives are interconnected. Love binds people together so completely that the loss of one life reshapes many others. Christianity views this interconnectedness as a call to responsibility, urging communities to notice suffering earlier, to listen longer, and to love more persistently. Prevention becomes an act of faith, and compassion becomes a moral obligation. Christ and the meaning of suffering. At the center of Christianity stands not a theory, but a person who entered suffering willingly. Jesus Christ does not observe human pain from a distance, nor does he explain it away with abstractions. He lives it, carries it, and endures it fully. The cross becomes the ultimate Christian response to despair, not because it glorifies pain, but because it reveals that God chooses presence over escape. Christ does not end suffering by avoiding it, he redeems it by entering it. This radically reshapes how Christians understand despair, because it means that no depth of suffering is unfamiliar to God. When a person feels abandoned, Christianity points to a God who cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Not as a failure of faith, but as the fullest expression of human anguish embraced by divine love. God who does not turn away. Christianity insists that God does not abandon people in their darkest moments, even when they believe he has. Scripture repeatedly portrays God as closest to the brokenhearted, not the triumphant. This challenges the idea that despair is a sign of spiritual failure. Instead, despair becomes a place where God's presence is most hidden, but not absent. The suffering person may feel unheard, unseen, and forgotten, yet Christian faith claims that God remains present precisely in that silence. This belief dismantles the idea that faith requires emotional strength. Faith, in its deepest form, becomes the willingness to remain alive even when certainty disappears. The shift from condemnation to compassion. Modern Christian theology marks a decisive shift away from automatic condemnation toward radical compassion. This shift does not deny the sanctity of life, but deepens it by recognizing the fragility of the human mind. When mental illness, trauma, or overwhelming despair distort perception, the Church increasingly understands that moral judgment must be tempered by mercy. The focus moves from asking, "Was this sinful?" to asking, "How much was this person suffering?" Compassion becomes the lens through which all moral reflection must pass. The Church's role transforms from judge to healer, from accuser to witness, from authority to companion. Responsibility of the community. Christianity teaches that suffering is never meant to be carried alone. When a person reaches the edge of despair, the failure is not only personal, but communal. The Church is called to be a living body where pain is noticed before it becomes unbearable. Listening becomes sacred work, presence becomes ministry, and patience becomes an expression of faith. Communities are not asked to fix suffering, but to refuse to abandon those who endure it. Silence, stigma, and spiritual platitudes are replaced with honesty, patience, and long-term care. Christianity's moral response to suicide therefore extends far beyond doctrine into daily acts of attention and love. Life is sacred, people is fragile. The Christian position ultimately holds two truths together without allowing either to erase the other. Life is sacred beyond human authority, and human beings are fragile beyond simple moral categories. Suicide remains a tragedy because life matters, not because people deserve condemnation. The holiness of life does not cancel the reality of suffering, it intensifies the responsibility to respond with care. Christianity refuses to simplify despair into either sin or sickness alone. It names the act as tragic, while embracing the person as wounded and worthy of love. In this tension, faith finds its most honest expression. The final Christian response. The final Christian response to despair is not judgment, explanation, or fear, but love that refuses to leave. Life is sacred, not because it is unbreakable, but because it is loved by God even when broken. A person in suffering does not need a verdict, they need presence. They do not need answers, they need to be seen. Christianity's deepest claim is not that suffering makes sense, but that no suffering is faced alone. In a world where despair isolates, Christian faith insists on connection. In a moment where death seems like release, Christianity whispers that life is still held, still meaningful, and still worth protecting. When silence speaks loudest. There are moments when words fail completely, when prayers feel empty, and when even faith seems silent. Christianity does not deny these moments, nor does it rush to fill them with explanations. Silence itself becomes a place of encounter, not because it is comforting, but because it is honest. In the deepest suffering, God is often not experienced as an answer, but as endurance. The Bible is filled with unanswered cries, unfulfilled hopes, and long nights of waiting. These texts remain not as failures of faith, but as proof that faith can exist without clarity. Christianity allows the wounded soul to remain alive inside the question, without forcing a conclusion. Silence does not mean abandonment. Sometimes it is simply the space where pain is fully acknowledged. The dignity that suffering cannot erase. Christianity insists that human dignity does not depend on strength, usefulness, or emotional stability. A person does not lose worth because they are exhausted by living. Even when someone feels broken beyond repair, Christian faith declares that nothing essential has been lost. The image of God remains, even when the person cannot see it in themselves. This belief confronts a culture that measures value by productivity and happiness. Christianity offers a counterclaim: life is sacred even when it hurts. Suffering may distort self-perception, but it cannot erase divine intention. To remain alive in pain is not weakness. Within Christian understanding, it is often an act of quiet courage. Mercy greater than judgment. At the heart of Christianity stands the conviction that mercy ultimately outweighs judgment. God's understanding of the human heart exceeds human categories of guilt and innocence. Modern theology increasingly trusts that God meets the suffering person not with condemnation, but with compassion proportionate to their pain. This does not trivialize the tragedy of suicide, but it refuses to believe that despair has the final word. The Church entrusts the wounded soul to a God who knows every hidden fear, every unspoken thought, and every moment where endurance felt impossible. Mercy becomes the final horizon, not as denial of responsibility, but as recognition of human limitation. What the Church is called to become. If Christianity truly believes that life is sacred and suffering is real, then its responsibility extends beyond doctrine and to live compassion. The Church is called not to police despair, but to shelter those who experience it. This calling demands patience, humility, and the willingness to remain present without solutions. Faith communities are asked to create spaces where weakness is not hidden and pain is not rushed. The most convincing defense of life is not argument, but love sustained over time. Christianity's credibility in this area depends not on what it condemns, but on whom it refuses to abandon. The final truth held together. Christianity does not offer a simple answer to despair, because despair itself is not simple. It holds together two truths without resolving the tension between them. Life is sacred beyond human authority, and the human soul is fragile beyond easy judgment. Suicide is named as tragedy because life matters. The suffering person is embraced because love matters more. In this balance, Christianity finds its most honest voice. Not a voice of accusation, but a voice that stays. Not a voice that explains, but a voice that accompanies. Not a voice that ends pain, but one that refuses to leave those who endure it. Closing statement. Life, in Christianity, is sacred not because it is painless, but because it is loved. A person in suffering does not need a verdict. They need time, presence, and compassion strong enough to withstand their darkness. The Christian response to despair is not to look away, not to simplify, and not to condemn, but to remain. In the end, faith is not proven by answers, but by love that stays when leaving would be easier.